John Carpenter's The Thing is not only one of the best horror films of all time, but one of the best films of all time. It was based on the short story Who Goes There by John W. Campbell Jr. under the pen name Don A. Stewart. The story was already adapted to film in 1951 with The Thing from Another World. Carpenter and his team did a readaptation of the original short story and made The Thing a much more faithful interpretation. Unfortunately, when it was released, it was deemed both a critical and financial failure. While the happy, heartwarming alien E.T. was dominating the box office at the time, the brutal, apocalyptic alien of The Thing didn't resonate, and the film opened in 8th place. Critics universally panned it. The New York Times called it depressing, overproduced, and the quintessential moron movie of the 80s. Roger Ebert said, "Because the material's been done before, and better, especially in the original The Thing, and in Alien, there's no need to see this version." The Washington Post called it a wretched excess. The bad reviews continue to roll in. The movie was even nominated for a Razzie for Worst Musical Score. Carpenter was depressed because he felt this was by far his best work. To add insult to injury, Christian Nyby, the director of the original, publicly bashed the film, saying, "If you want blood, go to the slaughterhouse." As the years passed, The Thing found its audience, and John Carpenter was vindicated. The movie is now considered a high watermark in filmmaking, and frequently is listed as one of the best films of all time. The story of The Thing continued in comic form with the publication of The Thing from Another World in 1991. In early 2000, Universal Interactive, the video game division of Universal Studios, was digging through their properties looking for the one most suitable to adapt as a game. Survival horror games like Resident Evil and Silent Hill were popular at the time, so they decided adapting The Thing would make the most sense. The game was published by Universal Vivendi and distributed by Konami. It received favorable reviews and went on to be a hit, selling over 1 million units. John Carpenter promoted the game, but had little involvement aside from voicing a character as a cameo. He did approve of the story and said the game is canon as a proper sequel to his movie. With the first game a success, a sequel was in the works, but was cancelled when the studio went bankrupt. All that remains is some stills from an art book and a teaser trailer. In 2004, Universal released the remake of Dawn of the Dead, which went on to be a moderate success, pulling in over $100 million versus its $26 million budget. After the success of Dawn of the Dead, Universal approached producer Eric Newman with the prospect of remaking The Thing. Newman considered the original perfect and couldn't improve upon it, so instead of doing a remake, he wanted to make a companion piece for it. He presented Universal with the idea of doing a prequel that would tell the story of the Norwegian team and the events that led up to the beginning of the '82 film. Much to his surprise, the studio was on board with this. They hired Ron Moore, the developer of the Battlestar Galactica reboot, to write the script. After that, they brought in Matthijs van Heijningen to direct. He was also a fan of the John Carpenter version, but didn't find Moore's script was right for the prequel. They scrapped it and went with a new script from Eric Hessier. An early version of the script included McCready's brother, but they quickly realized that was a terrible idea. They decided there was no way they could compete or avoid comparison with the iconic performance of Kurt Russell, so they opted to make the main character female. The first person they cast was Mary Elizabeth Winstead. They wrote her to be relatable to the audience, to bring them into this existing story. The rest of the cast was a mix of Canadian actors as well as some of the most famous actors in Norwegian cinema. They didn't want to have a bunch of American actors doing bad accents, which is why they hired directly from the source. The producer, director, and writer watched the original film numerous times and tried to retroactively stitch together the events that occurred in the Norwegian base. They went over the beginning of the film like it was crime scene footage, trying to piece together a narrative. There were no blueprints from the original film, and since the outpost was destroyed when it was first seen, they had a hard time trying to figure out the layout. They found a fan site called Outpost 31 that scoured the original footage to create their own blueprint of the base. They used their blueprints along with Kurt Russell's height for scale since he was in most of the scenes in the outpost. With the design of the film, they tried to be as accurate as possible. They used old lenses and 35mm film to make it appear like it was a film from the 80s. They refused to shoot it on digital or in 3D. Rob Bottin's practical effects in the original were nothing short of groundbreaking. Knowing that, the director and producers agreed they had to make as much of the film as possible with practical effects. They hired industry veteran Alec Gillis and his team at ADI to do the effects. They spent the next few months sculpting and designing the numerous transformations for the various things. Filming took roughly 3 months, mostly in sets built at Pinewood Studios, and in the larger sets built in a quarry in Toronto. The opening shot was filmed at the Cumberland Glacier in British Columbia, which was very close to where the original was shot. Since the base was destroyed and almost everyone dead at the beginning of John Carpenter's The Thing, they made sure to match up everything as best as possible. They gave an explanation for the axe in the door. They showed what killed the two-headed thing and how it ended up outside. They shot a scene where Collins was being closed in on by Thing, so he slits his wrists and cuts his throat, which is how they found him in the 82 version. They cut the scene for pacing, but did show his corpse for continuity. They matched as much as possible, even going so far as to replicate the broken windows. In the original film, the blood test is one of the most memorable scenes. They need to do something like that with the prequel, but we're having trouble figuring out how to do that without being derivative. The director came up with the idea of looking for fillings in their teeth. This stemmed from the discovery that the Thing couldn't replicate inorganic material. They also subverted the scene by not having anyone pop open, which is what people were expecting. In the end, like the original, Kate's still alive, but we're left not knowing what would become of her. In the epilogue, they have the remaining two survivors, Lars and the pilot, chasing after the Thing dog. The footage of the helicopter was new, but the footage of the dog was from the original, to create a seamless transition between the two films. They even matched the grenades that Lars uses. After filming, they moved into post and added visual enhancements to some of the creatures, like adding limbs to the Wolner Finch Thing. They did their best to make the effects a hybrid between practical and CG, with more emphasis on the practical. Heijningen assembled the director's cut and they screened it for test audiences. The executives watched this version and hated it. They wanted two major things changed. First, they thought the climactic end portion was confusing and wanted a different one. And secondly, they wanted almost all the practical effects to be covered up with CGI. The movie was supposed to be released in April of 2011, but they moved it to October to allow more time for the reshoots and the CG work. The original ending was quite different from what we got. In the original ending, Kate goes into the alien ship and finds dead alien bodies everywhere, in a way that parallels what went on in the Norwegian camp. While wandering the ship, Kate discovers confinement pods with different alien species. It was implied that there was an alien race that was gathering specimens, and one of them was a Thing. The Thing broke out of its pod and killed most of the crew. The pilot set the ship up to crash on Earth and then killed itself. The Thing tried to escape, but froze in the ice. Now back in the ship, the Thing took the appearance of the pilot alien and was trying to get the ship to take off. Carter kills the pilot to try to convince Kate that he's human, but we discover he's really a Thing. He did this because she was going to throw a grenade, which would have killed off all three of them. The studio removed the entire backstory of the Thing and added a CGI Sander Thing for her to fight instead of the pilot. They had to cover up the pilot, so they inserted this weird animation to conceal it. The director calls the original version the pilot version, and this was the Tetris version. The studio insisted on getting rid of the pilot alien, saying it wasn't scary enough. The studio didn't want this. They wanted this. The writer just posted on Twitter about the changes. We had so much amazing practical FX work. I was not in the room when it happened, but the decision was made to replace with CGI at some point. Broke my heart. In the end, after the reshoots, the movie ended up costing around $38 million. They called it The Thing because they couldn't come up with a proper subtitle. This led to a lot of people assuming it was a remake. The movie was released in the theaters on October 14, 2011, and opened in third place. It majorly underperformed, pulling in only $27 million. Critics and audiences didn't like it, and what was the number one complaint? The horrible CGI. After the movie flopped, Heijningen went back to directing commercials. In 2012, ADI, who did the practicals of the film, started releasing behind-the-scenes footage of their work on the creatures to their YouTube channel. People were getting to see what the monsters were supposed to look like, instead of what we got. The Griggs transformation was one of the worst, especially when you compare it to the practical. They even included footage of the pilot alien, which was never seen before. In the comments, someone from ADI wrote, "The decision to replace practical effects with CGI usually happens at the studio level. Many directors we work with prefer the look of practical, but are overridden by the studio. CG offers a more flexible way to patch holes and make corrections that could have been preempted by proper planning. CG artists aren't happy about not being given enough time to do their jobs properly. It's a lose-lose for everyone, especially the audience." Alec Gillis and Tom Woodruff Jr., the founders of ADI, were so frustrated by how their work was handled, they did a Kickstarter to do an all-practical horror homage to The Thing called Harbinger Down. It ended up becoming the most successfully funded sci-fi horror project in Kickstarter history. There were a few petitions started to release the pilot version of the film, but they didn't gain much traction, and most likely the studio would just rather bury it. Here's some of the practicals they covered up. The hand facehugger that kills Jonas. The Wolner Finch Thing. The Juliet Thing. They went out of their way to create these amazing monsters and expand upon the brilliant work Bottin did in the original. Instead of giving us that, they gave us a version with rushed CGI and a majorly truncated ending. I enjoyed the story in the prequel, which makes the bad CG even worse. They did an excellent job of recapturing the fear and isolation of the original, while still telling its own story. If they would have released the pilot version, I'm sure the film would have been held in a much higher regard and seen as a proper companion to the original, instead of a cheap knockoff.
Грашні дні злятні.